Right. Welcome to the sixth lecture of History of Svalbard. I hope you have had a pleasant weekend. Of course, sitting indoors and solving the quiz, and not bothering to go outside in the lousy weather, as I did. This evening's topic is the polar expeditions from Svalbard. Some of the great ones and some of the not quite so great ones as we have. During the first half of this lecture, I am going to talk about the early attempts and also the background. So we're going to return to this question I've touched upon a few times already, the question of the open polar sea and those issues there. Talk a little about the driving forces. I'm always interested in the driving forces. Why would people go into these remote regions in the first place? Talk a little bit about technologies and methods they used, how the competing approaches were with regard to exploration in Arctic areas. And then towards the end of the first half, I'm going to do a short timeline and mention a dozen of expeditions and talk a little bit about each of them to show you the development of North Pole attempts using Svalbard as point of departure, because it's first and foremost Svalbard we're interested in, of course. Then during the second half, we're turning our focus on the more modern expeditions employing aircrafts of various kinds, balloons, airships, and see how this developed into a virtual race in the 1920s, where Ny-Ålesund became an Arctic airfield in its own right, supporting a number of expeditions. And then finally, people were able to come to the North Pole. And so what? What was it to be found there? What was the point in spending all these resources and people's lives to get to this very remote point? So the problem we will be investigating, of course, the results and effects of polar expeditions, and not least, how important are they in the history of Svalbard. And we may also say how important was Svalbard for getting to the North Pole in the first place. But as you might have guessed, we will start off with a cultural heritage quiz, a piece of something, all kinds of what it's not erotic underwear. If you somebody by any chance got that idea, and it doesn't even have anything to do with that at all, but it has something to do with today's lecture. The answer will come at the end of the second half, of course, as usual. Right. To begin, if not with the beginning, the very beginning, but to recollect a little bit what we talked about in one of the earliest lectures, lecture 2, I believe it was, the various concepts of the Arctic regions that could be found in Europe and elsewhere. You have this this map I showed you earlier, also based on the Ptolemy's geography, reaching as far north as the 60th parallel to the Mystic Thule And then you have this notion of the Arctic as a closed ocean based on Scandinavian, in particular Scandinavian concepts of the Earth, where there was a land bridge, a possible land bridge between Greenland and the Eurasian continent. And then this concept based on Mercator's world map with the North Pole as a big black rock on the top of the Earth, surrounded by islands, but also suggesting the possibility of navigating through the Arctic Ocean and hopefully end up on the other side of the globe in Asia, where trade was to be found. More of a wishful thinking. So this, of course, was a great mystery that sort of plagued the Western world for a long time, because nobody was able to come into these regions for very obvious reasons. So after the first attempts to find the Northeast and Northwest Passage, the Europeans more or less gave up on that, and instead concentrated on whaling, sealing, and developing trade in coastal areas. But in the 19th century, there was a renewed interest in Arctic exploration, not only in Arctic exploration, but in global exploration. Perhaps you remember that I told you after the Napoleonic War, after they were finished in 1814, there was a long period of peace in Europe where the large navies had nothing to do, at least not for war purposes. So the large fleets had to be employed for other purposes in order to keep them at an alert. And all the big navies did that, the French, the British, the Dutch, but particularly the Royal Navy in Great Britain. They spent a lot of time going around the world supporting scientists and explorers in the name of the Navy, in the name of the Royal Society, to go around the globe, mapping, exploring, doing very good science. And I mentioned, for instance, Darwin being able to use one of those Navy ships, the Beagle, to go around the world and collecting data for his great theory about the origin of species. One of the reasons why, well, not one of the reasons, but one of the events that triggered a lot of exploration in the Arctic regions was a British expedition that went in to search for the Northwest Passage. The expedition of John Franklin. It was fitted out in 1845. It's a picture of John Franklin here. That person already at the age of 50 years. He was comparatively old among those British Navy captains, had taken part in many expeditions before that, also in the Arctic, and he was set to lead this big expedition with two ships going into the Arctic. Also, these ships had a small steam engine on board, so that they were employing the most modern technology of the time. So there were two Navy ships and a collier, a boat that carried coal for them. Not that they had any engine power to break through heavy ice, but at least they weren't completely dependent upon sailing. So they went into what they supposed was the opening to the Northwest Passage and disappeared. They had provisions. There were more than 100 men on board these two ships. They had provisions for 3 years. So the first year they were gone, nobody really was surprised, because quite a few of those shipping expeditions had to winter in the Arctic region. So that was not a sign of danger by itself. But when they didn't return after the first year, and there was no news from this expedition, and the second year went on, people back home in Britain, not least Lady Franklin, the wife of John Franklin, became very concerned about the fate of the expedition and her husband. She was very well connected to the top of the society in Great Britain, so she was able to stir up a great deal of interest in sending search missions to find out what had happened to the Franklin expedition. And there were many of them. Around 30 different rescue missions were sent into the area north of today's Canada and the United States to look for the Franklin expedition. Overland expeditions and ship expeditions. In 1850 alone, there were 11 British and 2 United States of America ships looking for Franklin in this area. No, although after 2 years, they did find traces of his first winter camp, but the fate of Franklin wasn't revealed until very many years later. Actually, in the 1980s, they found what is believed to be the graves of some of this expedition. Now, this was also spurred by the interest of mass media. People were learning to read and write in large numbers, and there were newspapers and there were journals available to the general public. And of course, events like this was of high interest. So also this spurred an interest in the Arctic exploration. So these were the heroes of the day. These were the sports stars or film stars of today. There was quite a big element of national ambition in this, and national pride and prestige. So this was not only an individual competition of expedition leaders, but also a competition between nations. So the Franklin expedition, of course, the focus was on the Northwest Passage, not on Svalbard, although Franklin had been to Svalbard as well, one of his expeditions. But it fostered a general interest in the Arctic. And in connection with this, there was a renewed interest in the theory of the open polar sea. One of the expeditions that went looking for Franklin was Elisha Kane's, an American expedition in 1853-54. They went very far north. You see the Davis Strait here, West Greenland. Here is the Hudson Bay, and the very complicated navigation through the Northwest Passage go in between here. But Kane was exploring the area between Greenland and Ellesmere Island, north in the Davis Strait, a place called the Smith Sound, which actually leads into the Arctic basin itself, the Arctic Ocean in itself. And they had to winter, this expedition had to winter in the area, and they got back carrying the injured and sick, everybody was more or less sick with scurvy after spending winter in this region, but they managed to get back in more or less in one piece. In 1855, they came back to the United States. On board Kane's expedition was also a doctor, Israel Isaac Hayes, man on the picture here, who later led his own expedition in 1860 to 61 to the same area near Ellesmere Island, and came back and published a book called The Open Polar Sea. The Open Polar Sea. He thought, as had Kane, they had spotted open water this far north, up in Smith Sound, and what they believed was that this was indeed the open polar sea. They had actually spotted open water. So how could this happen? Was this just a fantasy or a hallucination, perhaps, after spending a long time up in with little food and such? Well, open water can be found in this large stretches of open water. You know what a polynya is? Polynya is open water in salt water due to currents, sea currents, that the ice does not freeze over, the sea doesn't freeze over. So there are large areas which are open. These are called polynyas. You have them on Svalbard here as well. In Storfjorden, for instance, in the midwinter, you can find large stretches of open water due to circulation in the water. So they could have seen circulation like this in open water in the summer. What he did, his observations were checked, and his farthest north record was, in fact, when it was double checked, it turned out to be in the middle of Ellesmere Island, not at sea at all. So there was something suspicious about his calculation. And also his publication about the open polar sea was overshadowed by the fact that there was a civil war going on in the United States at that point, which took most of the attention. But at least there was some empirical evidence, or it appeared to be empirical evidence of open water in high northern latitudes as a result of these expeditions that went looking for Franklin. This idea had also support from a more theoretical point of view. If you remember, I talked about August Petermann, a German geographer, who was an acquaintance of Karl Weiprecht, the person who with the expedition that discovered Franz Josef Land. August Petermann, he was a scientist who seriously believed in the open polar sea theory. In fact, that was one of the reasons why the expeditions of Weiprecht were sent out, to discover that. And he made a map that was published in various, not least his own journal, Petermanns Mitteilungen, but also a wide circulation. And this map indicated this open polar sea because, as he thought, his reasoning was that nobody knew how the northern part of Greenland was because nobody had ever been there. So he imagined that there was a stretch of land north of Greenland that created an internal turbulence or circulation in the open, in the polar basin that would keep the ice away. And he also noted that there were warm currents, water, going into the Arctic Ocean. Of course, we know there is the so-called Gulf Stream or the North Atlantic Current that that also would add up to this circulation. So it was just a matter of finding the right entrance, and then you would find the open water caused by the circulation in the Arctic Ocean. Of course, this was theoretical consideration, not based on empirical evidence at all. But there were others that had the same idea. Silas Bent was another one who also, he was a bit more careful, because he talked about the supposed open polar sea. But again, it was based on wide ocean circulation of hot water. That was not a new discovery, but it was being explored. This was actually the Gulf Stream, but it was exaggerated. The heat generated from or Silas Bent at least, exaggerated the effects of the North Atlantic current. He thought that it would at least partly melt away the ice in the Arctic Ocean because of the circulation going in the Gulf Stream here, going into the Polar Sea, which is basically correct, and then also a current from the Pacific Ocean going through the Bering Strait, coming in, warm water coming in from the Pacific Ocean in the Bering Strait, and this creating a circulation in the Arctic basin, which will keep the ice away. Now, what you see here in this circulation map is not very far from the modern ocean current maps that we have today. But of course, he overrated the heat in the water. It was not able to melt the ice in the Arctic Ocean. So you see this theory of the open polar sea. It was it was not the universal theory of how the polar sea was, but it was at least given some kind of scientific backing. And then we remember Weprecht, who was at the Franz Josef Land in 1872-73. He was looking for the entrance to the open polar sea, or the possibly open polar sea, based on these theories by Petermann and Silas Bent. So he was sent out to test the hypothesis, as it were. He was not successful in that, but he found land that were hitherto unfound. There were competing approaches as how to get into the ice. This is a picture of our dear friend Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld, the Finnish-Swedish explorer and mineralogist who often visited Svalbard. But this is a picture from the expedition that made him universally famous, namely the Vega expedition that sailed through the Northeast Passage in 1878-79. Used 2.5 years to get through the northern sea route, had to winter along the way. Their experience using ships, and he had also used ships on Svalbard, as we shall come back to, was that there was no such thing as an open polar sea. Quite the opposite. There was a hell of a lot of ice in the polar sea. So much ice, in fact, that it was impossible to navigate with that kind of technology that they had. Wooden ships, even equipped with a steam engine, as was Vega, Nordenskiöld ship. They weren't able to withstand the powers of ice ridges and heavy ice. So it was almost a miracle that his big ship made it through the the Northern Sea Route or the Northeast Passage without being forced down by the ice, the pressing ice and ice ridges. So he was, to the extent that this was seen as a possibility, both Nordenskjöld and all the Brits that went into Arctic waters, they were equally disappointed. Everybody was disappointed because they were troubled, universally troubled by ice. One of these expeditions that went really bad was the Jeannette expedition, an American expedition that sailed into the Arctic Ocean from the Pacific side through the Bering Strait and was fast in ice in the eastern part of the Russian Arctic near the New Siberian islands. And this expedition they shipwrecked and they were killed. But it was important in the sense that this gave Nansen the idea, or rather one of his mentors, Moon, gave the idea of a drift, a ice drift that goes across the Arctic Ocean. I'll come back to that. Because this was the idea that Nansen had. Or rather, as I said, his mentor, one of his mentors, teachers at the Bergen Museum, who also was a meteorologist and a marine scientist. He got notion of wreckage that was found on Greenland, that they were able to establish that wreckage came from the Jeannette expedition, which meant that the only way that they could find wreckage on Greenland from the Jeannette that actually shipwrecked in the east of Siberia was that this wreckage had drifted with the ice across the polar ocean and ended up in Greenland. So based on this theory that there must be an ice drift across the pole, that was, or the Arctic Ocean, that was the very idea behind Nansen's expedition 1893 to 96, the ice drift with Fram across the Arctic Ocean. His concept was to sail along the Northeast Passage, let the ship freeze in as far east as possible, and then let the ice do the job. What you needed, of course, was a ship that could withstand the forces of the ice, and Fram was specifically built for that purpose. It had a very rounded hull, almost like an egg, so that when the ice started pressing, the ship would lift up. Instead of being crushed in the ice, it would lift up and stand on the ice. In that sense, it was successful. So Fram drifted across the Arctic Ocean, and this drift has been repeated a number of times. I think the last one was 1 or 2 years ago. They used half the time or less than that because of less ice, of course. So that was one approach. Again, ship, but then instead of trying to press through the ice, drift with the ice, and dependent on having a good ship. Another way was, of course, to do it like the experts of the region themselves did, namely going on foot, using skis, dogs, snowshoes, and sledges, sledding in dog teams in the Arctic, travel light, freeze at night. Yeah. This is a picture of this sinister-looking gentleman. Here is Robert Peary, who was the first, possibly the first, to reach the North Pole over land, or at least getting very close to the North Pole. he learned from the Inuits of Arctic Canada to drive a dog team to survive in these regions and going fast over the ice instead of using a ship. So whether or not he actually reached the pole, that is a controversial issue. It has been tested a few times, and I think it's fair to say that he must have been very close to the North Pole, but whether he was actually on 90 degrees north or less, that is a matter of discussion. And then finally, modern technology would seem to solve the whole problem. When you got aircrafts of different kinds, balloons, airships, and eventually airplanes, you could escape the problems of the ice and the sea altogether and just fly through the air to the North Pole without any problems whatsoever. That was at least the hope. As we shall see, it wasn't quite as easy as that. There were some problems because this was obviously very new technology. All right, let me tell you about a few of the polar expeditions, and polar expedition in the sense that the object of these expeditions was to go to the very North Pole itself, with Svalbard as a point of departure. That is the criterion. This one, the Chichagov expedition, we've already talked about. That was the Russian expedition with 2 ships having their base down in Resersfjorden and Tomtodden. Twice in 65 and 66 tried to go north with 2 ships, using the standard procedure, using ships, Navy ships, going along the west coast of Spitsbergen, which is, of course, very tempting because at Svalbard you can reach quite a high latitude because there's open water. Many other places of the Arctic, you would be fast in ice very soon. But at Svalbard, in a good summer, you could reach perhaps 81 degrees, 82 degrees north in a ship because of the open water, depending on the season. Now, Chichagov and his companions, they were unlucky because in both these years, in the mid of the 18th century, these were so-called closed seasons. There was a lot of ice, so they weren't able to go much farther than approximately 80 degrees north. That was just north of Spitsbergen. But and the inspirator of this expedition, Lomonosov, he was also, as I think I mentioned, a believer in the theory of the open polar sea. I've also mentioned the Phipps expedition. They came farther north, almost 81 degrees north with 2 ships, Navy ships again, the Racehorse and the Carcass, doing a lot of good science on the way, but of course their ultimate objective was to try and reach the North Pole. Following the open water north and eastwards, they got until approximately the area around Sjuøyene, 7 islands, where they got beset by drifting ice. And on the picture here, they are about to leave ship when it suddenly, the wind broke up the ice, so they were able to get loose with their ships. Again, unsuccessful. Here's our friend Franklin again. In 1818, 2 ships, Buchan and Franklin, came to Svalbard to do an attempt to reach a high latitude, preferably the North Pole. You see, in Britain, the Admiralty put up a premium that was relative to the latitude you got. The higher the latitude, the higher the premium you get. So that was a record initiative to set farthest north records. So there was a lot of incitements, economic incitements for the captains to press forward to try and reach a high latitude. Buchan and Franklin in 1818 were not so lucky. They got about to Magdalenefjorden on the northwest of Spitsbergen and had to turn back there. The only remains of them are two glaciers up in Magdalenefjorden, the Buchan Glacier, the Franklin Glacier, both of which are melting rapidly. So almost ironically, as the expedition also was unsuccessful. So they probably will be gone in a few years. There's two glaciers up there. But again, the same Franklin who later disappeared in the Northwest Passage in 1847. 1827. This is a very interesting expedition. Another of the heroes from the Northwest Passage searches, William Edward Parry. He had been on, I think, 3 different expeditions to search for the opening to the Northwest Passage. On one of which he lost his ship and he was court-martialed when he got back to England, but exonerated because he had done everything in his powers to save both ships and crew. He was a comparatively young man and a hero, a big Arctic hero in Great Britain. In 1827, he was commissioned to command the ship Hecla to do a North Pole attempt. This was an innovative expedition because Parry brought with him boat sleds, that is, boats with runners on them. He actually also had some reindeer with him that he hopefully could drag these boat sleds, but they weren't particularly happy. The reindeer weren't particularly happy when they were set on ice floes, moving ice floes. So I think they were probably considered as food rather than engines. So they ended up dragging themselves. I think Parry had an ambition to go to the north, the 7 islands, as far north as possible before starting on his expedition towards the North Pole over the ice. But he eventually had to set up his base camp in what is today known as Heclahamna in Sorgfjorden. That is why it's called Heclahamna. And there are a lot of place names connected with that expedition. So they set up their base camp there, where the ship lay, and then they went across the Hinlopen Strait and following the coast and went into the ice north of Sjuøyane. And they did set a new record, dragging those boat sleds over the ice, and they came above 82 degrees north. I think they had, 82 degrees 40 minutes actually in July. But at that point in the expedition, late in July, Parry noticed that he was actually on a treadmill. While they were moving northwards, the ice was moving southwards. So for every 2 steps ahead, they would revert one step behind. So they realized they would never get to the North Pole with the speed of the ice drift. So very soberly, they decided to turn around after having set this new record and went back to the Heclahamna in Sorgfjorden and back to England. But as I said, a new record and also a new innovative way of thinking. That you took the ship as far as it can go, and from there on, used smaller boats and on runners. These were metal boats, so they weighed about 1,000 kilos a ton. But they had lots of people to drag them. But of course, it went very slowly. I think I mentioned also the Turell expedition. That was a trial. They never got around to actually going on the expedition, but they had equipment, sleds with them to, if there was time during the expedition, they would have tried to make an attempt, but they never came around to it. So it was just a plan. But Nordenskjöld, who was a part of that expedition, he came back in 1868 using a ship this time. And that was this ship Sofia, which was a postal steamer used in the Baltic Sea. Supposed to be ice going. There's a lot of ice in the Baltic Sea, as you know, or used to be in the coastal areas of Sweden and Finland. And this boat also had a steam engine, as you can see on the picture. So he made 2 or 3 attempts starting from the Virgohamna area up in the northwest of Spitsbergen, going into the drift ice, and trying to reach a high latitude. Eventually, they got to about 81 degrees north, then sprang a leak, and just barely made it back to first Danskøya, and later they came down to Kongsfjorden, where they were able to repair the ship enough so they could get home. Not a very successful attempt, but again, ship. He came back, as we remember, in 1872-73. This time had planned to go sledding with reindeer. He had 40 reindeer with him. And they escaped during the winter. I've been to this place, Polhem, his station in Musselbukta in the northwest. In connection with another, we were registering cultural heritage. We found his storage of rain moss, reinlav. He brought with him reinlav, moss or lichens rather, to feed the reindeer. And he had a storage of that. And just nearby the station, we found the remains of that storage, which hopefully also the local reindeer were able to exploit later. I've always wondered where these southern reindeer had some kind of intercourse with the local reindeer. And maybe perhaps there are some genes of southern reindeer in the reindeer population on Svalbard. I don't know. Anyway, Nordenskjöld went also to Sjuøyane, experienced very high ice ridges, impossible to go across. So he turned around and instead went across Vestfonna, one of the biggest glaciers in Svalbard, and back to Musselbukta, where his station was. In 1894, an American journalist, Walter Wellman, of whom we're going to talk more detail in the next half, he came up here with a steel steamer, the Ragnvald Jarl, which he had chartered in Norway, and went into the ice. And it, being a steel ship, as soon as it met with ice, it sprang a leak and sank spectacularly in the neighborhood of Sjuøyane. But he didn't give up, so he came back to Svalbard later. I'm also going to talk about the André expeditions in 1896 and 97 in the next half. Balloon expeditions starting from the northwest. As I said, in Wellman came back, this time in using an airship, a motorized airship, in 1907 and 1909. Again, going to talk about that. Then in the 1920s, the aircrafts had become more advanced, more technologically advanced. In 1925, Amundsen and his American companion, Lincoln Ellsworth, came to Ny-Ålesund with 2 flying boats, fixed-wing aircrafts that could also take off and land on water, the N-24 and N-25. Going to talk about them as well. 1925. Reached 88 degrees north before having to turn back. In 1926, the year after, he came back, this time with an airship, the airship Norge. During the same spring, in May 1926, an American expedition came with a fixed-wing airplane, Richard Byrd and his pilot Floyd Bennett. They actually lifted off from Ny-Ålesund, went off and came back and said they had been to the North Pole. A first, as it might have been, possibly. And then finally, which I'm also going to talk more extensively about in the second half, the last of these aircraft expeditions in 1928, the Italian expedition with the airship Italia, and Nobile, who also was a member of the 1926 expedition. These are the main, until the Second World War, or after the Second World War, the polar expeditions that departed from Svalbard. So I'm going to talk about the latter ones in the second half, but for now, we take a 15 minutes break. All right. How are we doing? Questions? Yeah, good. I forget to see the chat. There's one very considerate person here who asked, did the reindeer make it? Probably not. Sorry to say, they did not make it. Sorry, Fredrik. I suppose they. I suppose it means the reindeer of Nordenskjöld. But it is really yeah. It's a puzzle. What happened to reindeer? Imported reindeer, southern reindeer coming to Svalbard, where did they just starve to death? What happened to them? We will never know. We are now turning our attention to the aerial age of polar exploration, using Svalbard as a point of departure. Remember this, there is one good reason, or the only, perhaps, only good reason why Svalbard should be the point of departure for these polar expeditions at all. Have you thought about that? Why go to Svalbard? Why start from Svalbard? I think the most obvious answer is that by coming to Svalbard, you will be at least 78, 79 degrees, possibly 80 degrees north without very much trouble, because you can get here by boat. Even late or early in the season, there is not so much ice that at least you would be able to come to 78 degrees north. So it's a very good start if you are planning to go to 90 degrees north. There aren't many places elsewhere that you can get so far north so easily as Svalbard. So I think that is the main reason why Svalbard became popular. Salomon August André, he was a Swedish engineer, worked in the patents office in Stockholm. He was not without polar experience. Salomon August André had actually been part of the Swedish expedition that wintered on Kap Torsen, the first international polar year, 1882-83. You remember? That wintered here on Kap Torsen, on the northern side of Isfjorden. He was not a scientist as such. He was more a technician and an engineer who helped, among other things, rebuild the house that Nordenskjöld had on Kap Torsen and turn it into a scientific station. Among other things he constructed was a remote sensing apparatus based on electricity to measure wind speed and wind gusts on the top of the mountain. Still, if you go to Kap Torsen, you can still find a copper wire for that observation platform. That was constructed by André. But his interest was not so much in the science, perhaps, as in the more technological possibilities of doing polar expeditions or doing polar exploration by employing modern technology. He had been to the United States and during a World's Exposition in Philadelphia, where he had seen balloon ascents for the first time and became fascinated with that technology. When he came back to Sweden, after some years, he was able to finance and buy his own hydrogen balloon from France. France was the leading producer of that technology at the time. The balloon Svea, with which he made a lot of ascents and test flights in Sweden, experimenting with ways of maneuvering this balloon. So he had a technological approach to this exploration. He believed that by using a combination of towing ropes and sails on the balloon, he would be able to deviate as much as 20 degrees from the predominant wind. I myself am not an expert in balloon flights. I've never been on board a balloon. But I find it hard to believe that anything else than wind direction decides where the balloon wants to go. You can't steer a balloon. He thought he could, by varying the height of the balloon, by using ballast, by using towing ropes, by using sails, he could deviate. But in principle, he would need a very stable southerly wind going directly to the North Pole if this was going to succeed, I think. But this plan that was presented in the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences was met with huge interest in Sweden, huge interest. Remember that this is 1896. This is at a point he formulated his plan and presented his plan in the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin, Stockholm, in 1895, at a point when Nansen was still out in the Arctic Sea. Nobody knew the fate of the Fram expedition. Enormous attention had been given to Nansen and the Norwegian expedition. And here comes Sweden with a high-tech approach to polar exploration while Nansen is away. So no wonder that this expedition got a lot of attention and also a lot of sponsors. So this was expensive, of course. But he had great supporters. The king himself, or rather the crown prince himself, Oscar, and also industrialists in Sweden, Oscar Dixon, after whom a fjord here in Eastfjorden is named, Dixonfjorden. But not least the very famous Swedish industrialist Alfred Nobel, who had made his fortune producing dynamite. He supported this expedition. So there was a lot of support for that. Since he had been himself on Svalbard earlier, it was natural for him, and since Sweden had a huge tradition of scientific expeditions to Svalbard, it was no wonder he went to Svalbard to look for a suitable station as a point of departure. And he found this in the northwest, where, for instance, Nordenskjöld, one of the advisors for this expedition, had been earlier with the steamship Sofia, namely in Virgohamna. And Virgohamna is called Virgohamna in honor of the ship, transport ship, that the expedition used. The Virgo. Virgo means virgin, of course, in Latin. Here, they built an aeronautical base consisting, first and foremost, of a balloon house, a hangar, if you will. But he also had a complete factory for producing hydrogen locally. So he brought with him the raw materials he needed to produce hydrogen locally. So they set up a hydrogen factory in Virgohamna using iron filings and sulfur acid. In fresh water, you can produce hydrogen gas, and they cleaned the gas. And that was a bit further west of the station. And then they had a fabric hose going from that production site up to the balloon so they could fill the balloon. Enormous interest in this expedition. This was a tourist magnet. So ships came, there was a lot of tourism and tourist boats on Svalbard during that summer, and they came to Virgohamna to witness the ascent with the balloon. But they spent quite a lot of time, of course, rigging the whole station and the base, and waiting for the most important factor of them all, namely a stable southerly wind. That never came during the summer of 1896. And it was getting late in the season. In August, on the 14th of August, Svalbard's National Day, as it were, an old, or seemingly old, very beaten sailing ship, three-mast sailing ship, came into the harbor at Virgohamna, the Fram. It had gotten loose of the ice north of Svalbard and came to Virgohamna, visited Virgohamna. The first thing they asked, of course, on board, Sverdrup asked captain, was, have you any news about Nansen? Because, as you may know or not know, Nansen had left Fram in 1895 to try to reach the North Pole on skis and with dogs in the middle of the expedition. At this point, Nansen was at Frans Josef Land. He didn't know that, but he was at Frans Josef Land. And he eventually got back, hitched a ride with a British expedition, the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition, and reunited with the Fram crew when they came back to mainland Norway. But Fram visited here, visited the Swedes, got no news about Nansen, of course, sailed back to Norway, met with Nansen there, whereas André packed together his expedition and went back. It was too late in the season to try a new attempt. The Norwegian famous author Alexander Kielland, who wrote in the paper that he wrote very ironically, with a lot of spite, that André went back with the balloon between his legs. And this was remember, this was at a period when Norway and Sweden were in union, and Sweden was the big brother, of course. But at this point in time, the late 1890s, Norway, or Norwegians, were becoming very nationalist and wanting to get out of the personal union with Sweden. So there was a lot of quarreling between Norway and Sweden at that point. So these expeditions, Nansen's expeditions, André expeditions, were of course also seen in this national strife between Norway and Sweden, and part of the nationalist sentiment that reigned in those. Yeah. So no liftoff in 1896. They actually met, Nansen and André, in Tromsø when André came back from Svalbard. Nansen and his crew was doing his tour of the Norwegian coast, visiting every town and city along the Norwegian coast and being celebrated as enormous heroes. I don't know how much cake they ate during their long journey along the western Norwegian coast, but it wasn't. There were written songs and music pieces in the honor of Nansen. They met in Tromsø. And Nansen shared, of course, his data and his impression from the Fram expedition with André, telling him, for instance, that a southerly wind is by far not the dominating wind direction in the polar basin. Quite the opposite. It's the northeast wind which is the dominating wind direction. But Nansen has later written about this meeting with André, and he writes very favorably about André. He admires his courage. I think he writes between the lines, you can read that he thought that this was a reckless expedition, but he admires his courage and his sense of honor. When André got back to Sweden, he immediately started planning for a second second expedition the next year. One of the expedition members, Nils Ekholm, incidentally, he was a meteorologist, and incidentally the person who had headed the Swedish expedition during the International Polar Year, he withdrew from the expedition. He didn't want to become a part of the second expedition. He had noticed, for one thing, the data from Fram expedition, that it was not likely they would have a stable southerly wind. But he had also noticed a much more ominous fact, namely that the balloon was leaking while they were in Virgohamn. It was leaking. Now, the balloon was enlarged and improved by the masters in Paris, Monsieur Lachambre and his firm. And the sponsors remained faithful, Nobel and the others. So he was actually able to fit out a new expedition the next year, came back to Virgohamn, where most of the infrastructure was still there. Again, they prepared for departure, and on the 11th of July, they went on board this little basket here, 3 persons, with all the equipment they needed for the North Polar expedition, a collapsible boat, a sled in pieces, all the provisions, everything was on board this basket and in baskets in the net of the balloon. They went on board. They tore down the northern wall of this balloon house, and André, who had been very doubtful whether this was going to happen, he gave the order, cut everywhere. And then the balloon went out of the balloon house and moving slowly towards the pole, or towards the north. They had, or to put it differently, if they had waited for 3 or 4 years, they might have had communication, wireless communication with them, because the wireless telegraph was invented in 1899, 1900. It was a very rapid development. This was a bit too early. The only way of communication they had, there were 2 things they could communicate. One thing was that they had buoys on board, floating buoys, that they could throw overboard with messages and hope that somebody would find those buoys. And the other thing, and that was high-tech of the time, they had carrier pigeons, brevdur, sponsored by Aftonbladet in Stockholm. So they had trained pigeons, I don't remember the exact numbers, homing pigeons, that they could write small messages, put them in an aluminum container and attach to the tail feathers of the pigeons, and then let loose the pigeons. 2 of these buoys, floating buoys, were found years later, one on the coast of Norway and the other coast of Iceland. Not very current information. One of these pigeons was actually retrieved. That was by a Norwegian sealer who was in the area a couple of days after they had left from Virgwama. A sealer came on, or suddenly a white bird landed in the mast of the sailing ship. And the skipper, of course, shot it. That is what one instinctively does when a strange bird lands in one's mast. And it fell overboard and was left floating in the water, since it was not a big chunk of meat, so it wasn't considered to be game. And then this skipper met with another sealer in the same area that told him about the homing pigeons, the carrier pigeons of André. So they turned around and put a boat on water, and they found this pigeon floating in the water. And this pigeon was actually later stuffed and exposed at the Naturhistoriska Museet in Sweden. And they found a message. On that message, it said, "All is well," one day after liftoff. In fact, it wasn't. All was not well at all. Because they had, at that point, one day after the liftoff, they had already crashed into the ice once, because the balloon leaked gas. It was weighted down by ice that condensated on the balloon, and the wind shifted. They first drifted towards the west, then the wind turned and they drifted east-northeast, and finally on the 14th of July, 3 days later, they made their final crash, where they weren't able to lift off anymore, on nearly 83 degrees north, quite far east, nearly 30 degrees east, up in this region here. And they realized, of course, that that balloon was never going to lift off again. So they started preparing for going south. Now they had, of course, contingency plans. So as you see, they had a boat on board, a collapsible boat, and they had a sled. So they lifted a lot of provisions and equipment on board that boat. And they had two options, either to march towards Franz Josef Land, where there was a depot, or Spitsbergen, where there also was a depot. First, they started towards Franz Josef Land, but again, they met with the same ice drift that drifted them westwards. So they drifted towards Spitsbergen and changed tactics. Eventually, the ice loosened up, and they ended up on an ice floe north and east of Kvitøya in the Svalbard archipelago. Actually, the ice floe broke in two, so they barely saved their camp. It almost split in the middle of the camp. And they saw Kvitøya, this island in the northeast, for the first time in September, late September. And in the beginning of October, they were able to land on Kvitøya, on the western tip of Kvitøya, one of two places on Kvitøya, which is a big glacier that is free of ice. And they landed there and made their camp there. That happened in October. And quite soon, they were already sick and troubled and probably dying at that point. Strindberg, one of the three on board this expedition, was the person who died first because he was buried by the others. And later also André and Frenkel died. The last entry into the diary is on the 17th of October, and they must have died shortly after that. Now, how do we know all these things? Well, nothing was known in the years around the expedition. But in 1930, a Norwegian, partly a sealing expedition, partly a scientific expedition on board the ship Brattvåg, they resolved the mystery because they went on shore on the exact same place on Kvitøya to get some fresh water. And they stumbled upon the remains of the camp, André's camp, and they understood by the finds that this was indeed André's last camp. So 2 more expeditions were sent through the summer to salvage the remains of the bodies and the equipment there, 33 years after. And among the things they found, there were fragments of the diary and also exposed film. And that is the reason why we have photographs of this march towards Kvitøya, because there were some 20, 30 photographs that they were able to develop and print. So they actually found out what had happened. And a publication came out of that on the expedition of André, which I recommend you to read. It's a fascinating story. The consequences of this expedition were that was actually when the André expedition disappeared. After a few years, also another Swedish expedition to the Antarctica, Nordenskiöld's expedition, not Adolf Erik, but Otto Nordenskiöld's expedition in Antarctica, also suffered a wreckage. And those 2 mishaps was a severe blow to Swedish polar research. So it was on a downward spiraling trend in the beginning of the 20th century. But this retrieval of André and that expedition in 1930, That started a new interest in Sweden for Swedish polar research. So actually something good came out of that, because from that time on, the Swedish rebuilt their polar expedition activities. This is the, from the publication, shows the flying route and the marching route of the Örnen, starting here from Virgohamna, crashing into the ice for the first time here after one day, being blown westwards, straight westwards, and then again northwards, and eventually crashing on nearly 83 degrees north, and then starting the march towards the south, ending up in Kvitøya. Would it have been possible at all without technology to go to the North Pole? One could ask, is this foolhardy, or was there any realism in this at all? Well, in 2000, the British David Hempelman Adams came with his balloon, started up on the tundra just outside where Eunice is, lifted off, went to the North Pole, came back, was picked up by the Sysselmann at Nordøstlandet, having been to the North Pole. So it was possible. Wellman has received a lot of spite in polar exploration circuits, and also in the general press. And it has something to do with his self-confidence combined with a lack of competence, I think. He was not the typical explorer in the first place. He was a journalist, actually. He was a political journalist, worked in Washington. But he turned explorer because he saw that polar expeditions was good news, important news for newspapers, and he wanted to be a part of that. And as I said, he didn't lack confidence in himself, so he was able to finance expeditions, Arctic expeditions, by getting newspapers to finance them, to create their own stories, as it were. So his first attempt at Svalbard was in 1894. I talked about that. They rented a ship in Norway, a steel steamer that was ran into the ice and sank near Sjuerne outside Nordøstlandet. He didn't give up. When Nansen returned from Franz Josef Land, Wellman got the idea that perhaps you could do the other way around, go to Franz Josef Land first and use that as a point of departure. So he set up in the where the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition had been at Cape Flora, and had that as a base camp, wintered there, and made 2 short attempts to go by dogs and dog teams from Franz Josef Land, both of which were completely unsuccessful. But then, obviously inspired by André, he came to Svalbard in 1907. Not with a balloon, but with the improved technology, namely when you put an engine, a propeller, on a balloon, what do you get? You get an airship. You're not subject merely to the winds, a southerly wind. You can actually have power to go, in principle, against the wind if you have a large enough engine. So we came to, he made a preparatory expedition in 1906. In 1907, he set up camp in Virgohamna, just beside the André camp. Also, he produced his own hydrogen, built a large hangar in Virgohamna, and with his airship America, made the first attempt, went only a few kilometers, was taken by the western winds, blown across the Smedenburgfjorden, and crashed on the glacier in the neighborhood. We had to be rescued. It was also late in the season, so it was not possible to do another attempt. So that was not a success. He came back in 1909 with an improved airship, a larger airship, the America II. You can see a picture of it here. Had 2 engines, reversible propellers. So it was pretty advanced, but it was not a big engine power. Again, he set off from Virgohamna. They lost a lot of ballast going out over the open sea, so the airship rose at a very high speed. They panicked on board and let out gas. So not very far from the coast on the northwestern islands, they were hovering over an ice floe. Nearby was a Norwegian research vessel that came steaming towards them. You can see them on the bridge here, asking Wellman if he wanted some assistance, which he accepted. So actually they took the whole airship on a line and towed it back towards Virgohamna. All the while, Mr. Wellman is reportedly sitting on the deck of Fram smoking a cigar, which is not a good idea when you have a couple of thousand of cubic meters with hydrogen above you. You shouldn't smoke. When they came back to Virgohamna and they were dismantling the engines from the airship, it loosened from the car, as it was called, under the airship. So the whole airship rose to the air until the pressure got so big that it exploded. And so if you go to Virgohamna now, you will see the remains of America spread over a large part of Virgohamna. So Bellman was subject of much sarcasm and irony by his peers, and particularly Nansen was not very kind to Wellman. So in the more professional circuits, he was a failure. But from a publishing point of view, from a newspaper point of view, he was quite popular for all these years. He was also a pioneer in one sense. He was the first person to use a wireless in Svalbard. So he sent a telegram to no other than the President of the United States from Virgohamna. So he was a pioneer in that case. When he came back to mainland Norway in 1909, he called in at Bodø, and he received a cable, as it was called, a telegram, that Frederick Cook, had reached the North Pole. That later turned out to be a fraud. He was put in jail because Peary came back later, 1 year later, and had better evidence that it had been on the pole. But for Wellman, of course, that was the end of Arctic expeditions, because when somebody had been to the North Pole, there was no point in going there. He made his last attempt of airship expedition trying to cross the Northern Atlantic, but he also crashed at that time, this time in Bermuda, in fact. And after that, he retired and wrote his autobiography called The Aerial Age, in which he gives himself a prominent position, of course. So 1909, either by Peary or Cook, the North Pole had been attained. In around 1920, Roald Amundsen was already an aging hero. He had been to the South Pole, he had navigated through the Northwest Passage, been the first to the South Pole in 1911, having borrowed from Nansen, who believed he was going to repeat the Framdrift across the Polar Sea. So he was owing Nansen to make an Arctic expedition. He got himself the polar ship Maud and started off with the Maud expedition that went on forever, started in 1918, sailing into the Northeast Passage and supposedly going to repeat Nansen's drift with Fram, something it never did, by the way. Amundsen got very bored across this, aboard this expedition. So he escaped and went to America, giving lectures and raising money for the expedition that was very expensive. There he met with this gentleman here, Lincoln Ellsworth, who was a big fan of Amundsen and wanted to become part of an expedition together with Amundsen. Amundsen had become very interested in this new aircraft technology. Actually, he was one of the first in Norway who got a certificate for airplanes. So he saw the possibility in using fixed-wing airplanes and tried to fly from Alaska to the North Pole. That was not successful. But then in 1925, he came to Svalbard. This picture of Lincoln Ellsworth. Lincoln Ellsworth was the son of Lincoln Ellsworth Sr., who was a very rich property developer and industrialist. He was very reluctant to support this expedition, but he gave money to Amundsen on the condition that his son Lincoln stopped smoking. This picture is from the Ellsworth with a fat cigar in his hands. So, by that time, I think his father was dead, so it didn't matter. So Ny-Ålesund became the point of departure for this expedition. They had Dutch, German airplanes, Dornier-Waal flying boats. You can see on the picture, the N-24 and N-25, equipped with Rolls-Royce engines, 2 propellers, as I usually say, one for going to the North Pole and the other for going back. And they lifted off in May, flew to nearly 88 degrees north when one of the airplanes got into trouble and had to land in between the drift ice at 88 degrees north. The other airboat, flying boat, landed as well. And then they spent 3 weeks up in the drift ice trying to prepare a runway and one of the flying boats to get back to the mainland. And they were able, by manual methods, to prepare a runway in the drift ice, lift off in one of the planes, I think it was the N-25, had fuel for 30 hours, flew above the clouds, had no idea where they were, landed on a fjord near Nordøstlandet, up here, where they were miraculously saved by a Norwegian sealer who saw they saw the sealer and they started the engines, and then by that way they were spotted and got back alive. After 3 weeks, nobody knew where they were. They got back to Ny-Ålesund, but they hadn't been to the North Pole. So the next attempt was to use another technology. Fixed wing airplanes were not that developed at that time. So he came back with the airship Norge, constructed in Italy by Umberto Nobile, again sponsored by Ellsworth. He came back in 1926. This was a second generation of airships, not these huge Zeppelins that the Germans used, but small and flexible, easily maneuverable airships. There you see the hangar that used to stand in Njolsø. At the same time, while they were preparing their expedition, which was supposed to be a transpolar flight, they were supposed to fly across the North Pole to America. At the same time, an American expedition with Richard Byrd and Floyd Bennett came with a 3-engine German fixed-wing airplane, came to Ny-Ålesund at the same time. And they started a week before Amundsen and Norge. They were gone for 15 hours. Then they returned to Ny-Ålesund and claimed that they had been to the North Pole. Later, that was doubted by the pilot himself, Floyd Bennett, who confided in a Norwegian colleague that they probably hadn't been to the North Pole, that actually Byrd had cheated with his calculations. But at least they were, they came before Norge. Norge, the airship actually came to the North Pole, crossed the North Pole on Lincoln Ellsworth's 40th birthday. And as you probably know, it crashed in Alaska, in Teller, Alaska. And but they survived and they got back to Norway and Italy. However, Amundsen and Nobile fell out. They both wanted credit for the expedition. So this became a national rivalry between the two, where Nobile felt the urgent need to make an all-Italian expedition. So he came back in 1928 with the airship Italia, flew it all the way from Rome up to Svalbard, made one test flight to Greenland, another test flight to Franz Josef Land before he set off to the North Pole. And it was on the way back that they came into a storm and gale. The airplane crashed. The men that were in the airship itself were torn away, and massive rescue operations involving 1,500 people, many aircrafts, many ships looking for Nobile. It was eventually salvaged by a Swedish airplane, by Lundborg in a Swedish airplane, and the rest of the crew by the Russian icebreaker Krasin. But that was the end of the aerial area on Svalbard. No more expeditions from Svalbard. As an epilogue, the Russian Kuznetsov came to the North Pole having flown there with a helicopter in 1948. That was possibly the first person who actually set foot on the North Pole. Wally Herbert came there with the dogs in 1869 and ending up on Svalbard, the first more or less unsupported expedition to the North Pole. But what did they find on the North Pole? Well, basically nothing. It seemed to be vastly overrated. There was no land to be claimed in this area. It was a deep sea, that we know because submarines had already been under the ice, American submarines, in the 1950s, and also surfaced at the North Pole. So, like Nansen had predicted, this was a deep ocean. The scientific results were meager from all these expeditions because there was the most of the data had already been collected by Nansen in 93 to 96. At that time, there were no economic interests, no strategic interests. That changed later in the 50s and the 60s, but hardly worth the trouble of all these expeditions. To explain all this, perhaps prestige, personal and national prestige is the best way to explain it. I Must Have Fame is a famous statement by Peary, who said that to his mother, wrote that as a young man, and he wanted to find that in polar exploration. Mass media must have played an enormous role. Just to finance these expeditions, you needed a large number of followers, and newspapers and magazines could help that. This is what I call polar exploration by proxy. You could be an armchair traveler, following the explorers, reading about them in the paper. So the question, are these expeditions important in the history of Svalbard at all? I'm not going to answer that question, but you can ponder about it yourself. In the meantime, I can tell you the solution of the cultural heritage quiz. This is although it's not erotic underwear, it is silk. It's a fragment possibly from balloon material. We don't know what it was used for, but it was found in Anders' camp, in the last camp on Kvitøya. You can see the remains of the camp there. There is a monument standing on Kvitøya as well, where he was, that camp was found. Sorry I went a little bit over time today. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about how to get rich on Svalbard without trying, in a historical manner. There's no recipe for you, of course, I'm sorry to say. Thank you and have a nice evening.
Thank you.